for only maybe the second or third time doing this on Google Plus via Hangout. So it's a big experiment. Tonight we have with us Doc Stowaway Coleman.
Good evening. As I recall, if this works, this was a successful one. But we tried this a couple times before.
We have with us JP the CSS Ninja Lozier.
To quote the silent monks of China,
very profound. Very profound.
Full of
yes, and vinegar. And Jeff the Dark Lord Height.
And I'm going to channel Lawrence Simon tonight and drink my coffee while we go.
Yes, coffee is good.
I'm out of tea.
And oh dear. Oh dear. Bad Doc Coleman, no biscuit. And
no, I'm out of
course,
tea and biscuit. Damn.
And your lovely host, as always, Scott Roche. Actually, I'm turning over the hosting duties this evening to the Dark Lord Height. We're going to be talking about Secret Origins, I believe. Origin story, something like that. Anyway, the con is yours, sir.
Excellent. I don't get the con very often, but when I do, man, it's a great con. We're going to talk about origin stories. We want to talk about the differences between origin stories and world building, how you go about origin stories, different people's origin stories, and some examples throughout fiction of different origin stories. Since this was kind of Doc's idea, I'm going to let him go first. Doc, do you have a particular origin story that you'd like to point to as an example of a good origin story?
Good origin story. Well,
I mean, most recently,
look, I am so unprepared.
Most recently, the origin story that I can think of off the top of my head was like the Wolverine origin story.
Yeah, it's.
I don't know if that was a good one or not.
The Wolverine origin story is it keeps getting retold.
As opposed to
that's
Batman
the great
or
thing.
Spider-Man.
That's the great thing about the Wolverine origin story, though. There are so many holes in that story because there are so many holes in his memory.
Mm-hmm.
You can play with that a little bit.
Right.
But
Yeah, and at that point, they're not so much origins as much as prequels.
Yeah.
Like
That'd be
the Wolverine movie coming out.
that'd be good to talk
They're
about in
planning it
addition
now.
to origin stories.
see,
Right.
I think when you come down to origin stories, I actually prefer Spider-Man's origin story, just to pick another familiar pop culture reference. Even though when you look back on it now, with all the things that we now know about recombinative genetics and the kind of physics you need for actual superpowers, it's even more ridiculous than before. But it's still an emotionally engaging story, even if the science kind of is flimsy.
Well,
Right.
that's the thing about origin stories. I think they have to be
Mm-hmm.
really emotionally engaging, even perhaps more so than the future stories, because that's like that's your hook. In
Right.
comic books, if you don't buy into the origin story, then it sets the tone for the rest of the piece.
Right. Right. So
Is that a dissenting opinion, JP?
No, I liked your title a little.
You like my lower third?
Future
Yes.
famous author.
that's very well done. Well done.
Thank you. But
It's
what got me started thinking about origin stories was actually the fact that I was thinking about getting back into edits on my novel, which is in itself an origin story because it's a first book. and basically tells about Professor Crackle and Miss Bang and how they got together and how the narrator ended up traveling with them. And it was a story I was reluctant to write at first because there's something about the stories that kind of start in the middle of the action that are somehow compelling, that leave all these questions. But when you come down to it, whether or not you write the origin story, you need to know it. You need to know where your characters come from and how they develop the abilities that they have.
Right. And without an origin story, I mean, just like world building, origin stories are important because, or at least for an author, they're important because you've got to know your character well enough to tell the story, and without that, your characters end up being cardboard. The question is whether or not you need to tell that origin story.
I think in comic books, or in that sort of paranormal sort of setting where your characters have larger than life abilities, it's important to know how they got those and how they first decided to use them. So I think in the superhero genre or in the superhero-esque kinds of fiction that we're seeing these days, the origin story is fairly important. So I think that you do need to tell them in those cases. I think there's a difference between like a prequel and an origin story. It's almost like, for me, the first Crackle and Bang story wasn't so much an origin story as it was a prequel. But I mean, that may be splitting hairs.
Well, if you're referring to A Walk in the Park,
right?
That actually is somewhere like about the first third mark of their journey.
Okay.
Because the first book is how they get together, then there's an adventure in India, then there's another one over the ocean, and then they're in Australia. And from there, they go to the United States. Then after that, they come back to India. And they've got at least another European adventure in the timeline there. But I was trying to do something where I jumped into the action. So I went ahead and went with the short story. With A Walk in the Park as a short story, just trying to give a snippet and raise interest. And it worked with some people, didn't work with others, but I came back to it and I said, I really need to talk about how these people, or at least how the narrator got involved with these people. And I found myself going back to the first story for the first full novel.
Right.
And in case for those people who haven't read the Crackle and Bang story, you can find that in our steampunk issue if you go to flyingonthepress.com and look for
steampunk stories.
Yes, there were quite a few good steampunk stories, but that one is definitely a very good example of it. So please check that out while you're sitting here watching us talk. So
I think.
Go ahead, Scott.
Probably another good example of an origin story that isn't superhero oriented would be Casino Royale, the most recent one, because that's where we get sort of James Bond's origin story, and he starts out as as not the suave, sophisticated spy that he would eventually become, but as this sort of rough around the edges. A little bit impulsive, and so it's. I think part of a good origin story is also showing your character, sort of in the developmental stages of whatever. their story is. It shows them rough, and eventually you get them smoothed out. They mature as they move forward, hopefully. They grow, at least. So they don't necessarily, but then again, James Bond is sort of a larger-than-life character, so...
Right, and I think if you've got a larger-than-life character like James Bond, or really pretty much anybody else that's a larger-than-life character like that, the necessity of a origin story is there. Or I don't know if it's the necessity. It's a what's the right word? It's nice to have it, because sometimes people, especially when the story gets huge like that, it's sometimes nice to be able to go back and look at where things got started before this character became so much larger than life than they really are.
Right. I mean, and it's not. And I think it's also one of those things that isn't necessary, but it can bring a lot to the world.
Right. Absolutely. So we've talked about favorite origin stories and kind of where origin stories can come from. Where are I guess the question I'm trying to get to is when is an origin story not necessary, and how do you determine that?
Well, some characters predate their origin stories, like the Shadow, a lot of the radio serial characters. So they, unlike where, with the early movies of Spider-Man, for example, they did the origin story, but many of them are just so iconoclastic or archetypal, excuse me, that they're there. Eventually, there might be an origin to give some more backstory or some interesting story, but they can survive on their own, just being the enigma of the masked figure.
And I would argue that the case of like a new Spider-Man, I don't think that it was necessary to go to the origin story for Spider-Man.
For the latest movie.
Right. I don't think it was necessary to do that. It was an interesting choice to do that, but I don't think it was necessary. And Laura's asking where Galley Table is. I'm telling her we're in Google Plus. So see if you can re-invite her.
Yeah, I'll re-invite her.
She spent the last 40 minutes trying to get Skype installed.
I know this kind of headache, yes.
Yes.
And Scott, I would actually disagree with you on the need for the origin in the latest Spider-Man. Just because his origin was different enough, his powers were different, like the inorganic web shooters, things like that, that they needed to at least go into it. They might not have needed to go into a lot of depth on it, but yeah.
I mean,
I think they needed to touch on it.
Having not seen the most recent Spider-Man, having not seen any of the Spider-Man, I think really the origin story a lot of times for some superheroes is a little bit overdone. I mean, you've got Spider-Man got bit by a spider. He got his powers.
Mm-hmm.
Origin story. There you go. Let's go on with the tale. Now, I'm not saying that was bad the way that they did it, because again, I didn't see it, but I don't think that a lot of times you really need it. Did you need? And let's switch from superhero genre to something to more straight sci-fi genre and go with the latest Star Trek movie. Did we need to know Kirk's background? Did we need to know any of it? And then we have the whole reboot issue. But let's just stick to the fact that did we really need to know his background?
I think it was integral to the plot of this story. You know, what happened 3 weeks after the end of the movie, you know, whatever the characters go on to do, whatever next adventure they have, I don't think that they might have needed an origin story for that. You know, but I think because the antagonist was related to the death of Kirk's father and, you know, and Kirk's birth and things like that, I think you kind of needed a little of that.
Well, it's kind of interesting if you're going to look at Star Trek. We were talking about examples where you don't need an origin story. If you look at the original series, you didn't have an origin story. You didn't have a story that was about the crew being put together. You just, boom, they're at the start of their 5-year exploratory mission. This is your crew. They're going off exploring. Hey, they found something.
Right.
You learned about the characters as they did your job. You didn't necessarily learn who met who, when, if any of them had history together. You just, boom, you went along. But for the movie, when they needed to reset the stage, then they needed to go back and do that origin story, and they needed to give you background about, you know, that this is what changed from what you thought you knew.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really goes into it, is you need an origin story when you need to set the stage.
Yeah,
There's
okay.
some, if you've got a stage that's familiar enough, you can jump into it. Some people would be surprised at the concept of Star Trek coming out in the 60s with the idea of it being familiar enough, but it was a Western set in space, which was a very popular, very familiar format, and it used very military themes, which for a country coming out of the Korean War and World War II was very familiar. So even though the space trappings were new, the rest of the setting was familiar. So people could sit back and get to know the characters as people and understand where they were coming from. And that's part of why the original Star Trek characters are a little bit of caricatures to start with.
Yeah, I think if you're not going to do an origin story or a prequel to sort of set the stage, you do have to rely a little bit more on tropes or archetypes than you might have to otherwise. So, and if you're going to take a much beloved property like Star Trek or Spider-Man and reboot it after a significant period of time or try and introduce it to a new audience, then I think an origin story is called for. But you know, with this most recent Spider-Man, which I think was kind of pointless, I don't really get why they felt the need to do that. Because they changed his origin yet again, I guess I see why they went back to high school.
Honestly, I think it was a rights issue. My understanding was that if Sony didn't come out with another Spider-Man movie, the rights were going to revert to Marvel. So they needed to come out with something quickly. So they redid the origin story, and they tried to, admittedly, they tried to update it for a more modern understanding of science than what we had 50-some years ago when Spider-Man originated. But how well they succeeded is a matter of personal opinion.
I do like that they went back to the organic web shooter. I mean, to the mechanical web shooters.
Right.
So
I'm just amused that they did not have Peter develop them entirely by himself. But
well, I agree with some apologists for the.
it's Laura! And she's all in black. Sexy.
That is correct.
Ooh, she's playing the Invisible Woman. I didn't
Echo,
hear.
I have to put my head.
Yes. Please put your headset over your delicate shell-like ears.
There were some people drinking straight from the bottle. You go, Doc.
Yep.
There were some people that said that the reason for the organic web shooters was it wasn't exactly believable that this high school kid would invent the mechanical web shooters, which, whatever, it's a superhero thing. So
And then he couldn't come up with the formula for an incredibly strong spray silk that would dissolve after about an hour.
Right. So but with comic books, I check. I don't check my brain at the door, but at least I engage my my imagination a little more than I might with something else.
Right.
So, Laura, are you there? Sort of. You're siloning or something. So let's see. We've talked about.
I was trying to think of a movie that that had a character that was known, but did not go into an origin story, and I actually came up with one after a bit of searching.
Okay.
Mentally. Van Helsing. It delved into it. It touched on it as it was related to the plot, but not all the way. It didn't focus on it.
You're talking about the movie Van Helsing.
The movie Van Helsing, yeah. The Hugh Jackman film.
And given what they did with him and that whole sort of secret underground church monster hunting organization, it might have been a little more fun if they had gone a little bit more into the origin of that whole relationship. But then again, that would have probably killed some of the momentum they wanted.
Right. Yeah, it was a comic book movie. It was meant to be a fast-paced thing, and you would have lost everything if you hadn't done that. What about more recently, the movie Prometheus? Has anybody seen that one yet?
I have not been able to see that, and it's out of the theaters, and it's not yet anywhere I've been able to pick it up.
I haven't seen it, but I've read enough about it on the internet to feel like I have an opinion about it.
All right, share your opinion.
We're
not shy about that.
Well, I mean, just how I kind of see where you're going with the question. It is an official or unofficial prequel to the Alien movies, and we get to see some of the origins of the creatures that were in the Alien movies. So that was an interesting attempt, I guess, to answer some of the questions that we were left with from the original trilogy. So, it would be, it's interesting that has that ever really worked where somebody takes a much beloved trilogy that has some holes in it or alludes to some backstory, so they make a prequel or a prequel trilogy? Has that ever really worked? Not that I'm alluding to anything in particular.
No, not of course not.
None of us know what you're. I see all these blank faces, so you're all shocked that my voice is on the airwaves.
Well, now it's starting to come through nice and clear.
Just a little bit of an echo there, that's all.
So yeah, I mean, has a belated prequel or origin story ever worked well? Are there any good examples?
I can't think of any good examples. I mean, obviously you can point to the bad examples. You've got the obvious one, the one that we hesitate to mention, is the Star Wars prequels.
The prequel that shall not be named.
Exactly.
Part of it is I'm just trying to think of examples of a successful property that went back and did some kind of a prequel, and I don't think there are an awful lot of them. To go back to Star Trek, you had the Enterprise series, which was, not so much the origin of the crew from the original series as much as it was an attempt to go back and say, okay, this is where Starfleet and the Federation of Planets came from.
Well, there's the X-Men thing.
X-Men
First Class.
First Class.
I guess there is that.
What was that, Laura? Yeah, we're not hearing you.
Yeah.
We're glad that you have internet, Laura. We wish you had better internet.
Yeah.
Laura auto-tune.
Sorry.
So yeah, there's
It's like-
there's X-Men First Class. I'm not sure if that was a good example or a bad example because I didn't see it, but there's that.
There were some good things, and there were some. It was an entertaining story if you didn't know anything about the X-Men. If you did know anything about the X-Men, then it was kind of a case of, okay, that's just cute, but it doesn't fit.
Right.
Then again,
Well, what about outside of film?
yeah, actually, I was about to go with an example outside of film. I don't know how popular this series is, but if you look at Mercedes Lackey's Heralds of Valdemar, which I can't even begin to make a quick guess about how many different volumes she's written about the Heralds. But eventually she did go back and she did a trilogy on the founding of the country Valdemar in her world, and how the Heralds came to be, and where the companions came from.
Right. Another.
And as far as I know, that was actually rather well received. And she has done things where she's taken stories from her timeline. Her first Heralds of Valdemar story was the Arrows of the Queen, which established who the Heralds were, that they have these white horses that are the companions that give Heralds special powers when they bond with them. And they referred to a past where there were herald mages, which were people who were heralds, and they actually were able to use magic. And then she went back and did the Herald Mage trilogy. And one of the interesting thing is, if you look at the Arrows of the Queen series and you look at things that were referred to in the past, when you did the Herald Mage trilogy, she changed the details, which I thought was brilliant, because it's the kind of thing that shows that recorded history is usually not right. The way things really happened was different than the way they're reported to have happened 100 years down the line. But she's done that pretty successfully, going back and telling earlier stories in her timeline to give you more backstory, but she usually separates it from everything else by at least a few hundred years. So she's got fresh characters, fresh elements to the setting than what you would have remembered from the later books, or from the books that were later in the timeline. We can see Laura now. Yay!
Yay! That's exactly what I was thinking.
I can't.
Hello.
It's kind of a still picture, but it's an improvement.
Oh, Laura does not have the bandwidth for this.
So let's see,
It's like
other genres,
I
other
was thinking.
mediums.
I was actually thinking of Ender's Game. Not Ender's Game in particular, but the Shadow series that he wrote after the first 4 books. And he went back and he explored Bean's origins and then followed him through and where he went. That's not exactly an origin story, but it does kind of go back in time and kind of start over again. Does that make? Has anybody else read that series at all?
Mm-mm.
I'm afraid I haven't.
Okay.
I did. There's. Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff. Were you done?
I was just going to say, Bean is a rather minor character in Ender's Game itself, and then once Ender's Game is over, he disappears completely for the next 3 books. And then Orson Scott Card went back and actually developed that character and went 4 books just with him, pretty much, which was kind of an interesting way to handle it. But not looking at the main character and figuring out his origins, telling it from a completely different person's point of view, and kind of getting an idea of where the other characters went after Ender went off Earth. So,
I kind of like that idea. Sort of, this is what's happening elsewhere in the universe.
Yeah, it's if you haven't read it, it starts with Shadow of the Giant, and it is an absolutely great series. So.
I was going to say it would be this would be kind of like more like spin-offs, I guess, than they would be origin stories. But I guess here's another example. I guess you could consider this an example of a going back with a popular character and retelling their origin, Smallville.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty good example of taking a popular property and the whole series is one long origin story.
Right.
Right.
Never in my awareness have we gotten such a detailed sort of backstory of a hero like that, and that was very popular.
Right.
And it was done very well. But
Not
the trick
only
was
the backstory of heroes, but of the villains involved and a lot of the associated characters.
Yeah. So, I think I wonder what made that work, and maybe it was the fact that they avoided any of the spandex and any of the sort of trappings that we associated with the Superman character, and it was all about Clark and him trying to figure out what to do.
The basic rule for Smallville was no spandex, no capes, and no flying. Right. So anything else going on, sure, but none of those things.
So with origin stories, especially if you're going to go with a protracted one, you have to play around with parts of the character that they're not necessarily known for, which again brings me back to the James Bond Casino Royale. I mean, we got to see parts of James Bond you didn't get to see later on.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so it's about that time. We need to come up with a random question. For those of you who don't know, at the end of every show, usually Zach, who has abandoned us this evening, we are captainless, which is why you get what you get. He normally comes up with a random question, but tonight I am going to come up with a random question since I am pseudo in charge here.
So roll percentile dice and consult the random question table.
Exactly. Which has been pre-set up by our lovely commander, so we're all good. All right, so the random question this evening is not going to be about origin stories. In fact, it's going to be about endings. And what I want to do here is talk about your favorite ending to a beloved trilogy, or a beloved series. There obviously have been quite a few out there, and yeah. And so, if you can let us know what your favorite ending to a beloved series was, and we'll go with the standard. Doc, I'm throwing you under the bus.
Okay. Favorite ending to a beloved series. I think I would have to go with the ending of MASH. Because the whole umpteen years of the show were about the Korean War, so it was kind of the simplest way of wrapping everything up was just to end the war and send people home.
Right.
And it was also kind of interesting that the whole series of MASH is about how these doctors, in order to keep their sanity, have to be insane when they're not working. And
right.
What? Spoilers! Look, it's a 20-year-old ending, and I'm coming out as spoilers if you haven't seen it. But they turned that whole thing on its head by starting off with having the main character having already snapped. And having him broken under the pressure of war and actually be in a facility for phrase is eluding me right now. For mentally impaired.
The mentally impaired, yeah.
Yeah. And looking at trying to reestablish his sanity so that he can go back into that meat grinder.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's my ending.
Scott, you got one?
I do. I'll go with. Wow, we're suddenly getting a lot of echo.
I think it might be JP.
I'm gonna go with it's. Technically, it's not the ending. It was supposed to be, apparently, based on what I read. I just finished the 4th season of Breaking Bad. And apparently it was supposed to be the last season. And it really would have worked well as an ending because they tied up all of the loose ends. But because they knew it was coming, it worked really well. And it had a lot of dramatic punch. Which is why I don't. Everybody's raving about the 5th season, which I haven't started to watch yet. And I'm wondering how they're going to pull that off. Because apparently this 5th season is really, really the end. So I think it did one thing well that it didn't need to do. And that is really tie everything up.
JP?
Ask the question, I'm sorry.
The question was, what is your favorite ending to a beloved series? Whether it be a book series or a television series or a movie series.
Can we use Firefly or Serenity?
Yes, absolutely.
They made a whole movie. It was a prequel. There you go. It was a prequel, it was an origin story, and it was an ending.
All right. Yes, I think that's an excellent.
And of course, a tribute to Joss Whedon.
I'd still rather they did a 5-series arc, but no.
Yes, a 5-season arc.
Season
I think would
12.
But see, I hear everybody lamenting Firefly, and I absolutely agree that I wish it had gone longer than the first, season. But if it had, we wouldn't have things. I don't think we would have had the outcry that we had, and some of the characters and some of the actors that were in it wouldn't have been able to develop into who they are today if they'd stayed with Firefly.
The idea being that if we hadn't had Firefly canceled, we wouldn't have Castle now.
Right. Yeah.
And he might not have made 8mm. Not 8mm. That's a different movie.
Yes, it is.
Super 8.
Yeah, Super 8 or Avengers, or he wouldn't have been able to work on these things because Josh would have been busy doing Firefly.
No, if he'd done Firefly for 5 years, he'd been done with it.
That's true.
He might not have had Dr. Horrible.
This is true.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have been a horrible loss.
Yeah, actually, it would have. Literally.
Well, I mean,
No.
oh yeah, okay, that was unintentional. Sorry. So, Jeff.
All right, so I'm gonna go with my. Unfortunately, I'm gonna go with my standard. I'm gonna go with Deep Space Nine, and I really liked the way that series ended. Wow, background.
Yeah, sorry, my wife's phone is going off, and her ringtone is "Get Over It" by the Eagles.
Yeah.
There she is.
The characters had really grown throughout that series, and I liked the way that they just kind of wrapped it all up. And it felt like they closed it well, and it was really at that point it was the end of the TNG universe. And I think it wrapped that whole thing up pretty well.
Yeah. Speaking of Scott,
Yes.
could you mute your mic unless you're actually saying something?
Okay.
Because we're hearing somebody's conversation.
Yeah.
I thought of one other when I mentioned 5-year arcs, and that was Babylon 5. And part of the reason that Babylon 5 worked so well as an ending was because that was the original arc that was planned. That it was always intended to be just that long of a series to start, run through, and end. So there were things all through the earlier seasons that were leading up to the ending, which you really didn't realize. I mean, when you had the first commander go away and a new commander brought in, it seemed like it was a season change that might have been a contract issue. And it wasn't until you got to the last season when all of this stuff starts clicking together that you realize that no, this was planned all along. That J. Michael Straczynski had this in mind from the beginning. And it got to be one of those things that like watching Steve Moffat's Doctor Who. That's like, damn, he's planned these things out way ahead of time.
Right. All right, so that's everybody. What I'd like to do is go around the table real quick and let anybody promote anything new that they've got going on, and that'll be it. So, Doc, if we'll start with you.
Okay, if you want to find out about what I've got going on, just head on over to www.doccoleman.com. And you can see the stuff that's going on with the Nifty Tech blog, the Shrinking Man project, and the stuff coming out of Swimming Cat Studios. I've actually got a new review from Scott that I need to get edited and up for Nifty Tech Blogs, so that should be coming out in the next couple weeks. I need to get back into doing updates for Swimming Cat Studios. I've been amiss this summer. But part of that is because of work that I've been doing, trying to get a story ready to come out for Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences, and trying to get my short story, Welcome to Paradox, ready for self-publishing. So those will all be coming out in the next couple months, so keep looking for them. And I'm done.
And I can't. My mute microphone on mute.
We can hear you, Jeff. You're not muted.
Well, you are now. Well, I'll go next. We've got a couple things coming out in the near future. First is a story that is unavailable anywhere else. There will be the first part of a 3 or 4 part series that's coming out. It's an online magazine from Blue Sun Studios, and if you'll just follow me on Twitter or on Google+, I'll definitely be shooting out a link when that's available. Also, I just dropped a new story in my Omniverse podcast that isn't available anywhere else in print or in audio, so a lot of exclusive things coming out over the next week or so. So just stay tuned to my Twitter feed or my Google+ feed, and you'll find out all about those things.
Wait, Scott, you're writing for another magazine? How could you?
We're not doing serials yet.
That's true. I did oatmeal this morning.
Also, this isn't exactly for us feel-wise. So.
All right, JP.
Well, I'm planning on going down planetside for Flying Island Press to help with an away mission, but that's about it.
Yeah.
I'll be back soon.
Don't wear a red shirt.
Don't worry.
Hmm?
If you do wear a red shirt, make sure the captain gets some nookie. It'll increase your survival chances. The irony is that earlier today, I actually stumbled across a site where somebody had done a business analytics analysis of the red shirt phenomenon, and they found that the biggest thing promoting the survivability of red shirts on the original series was actually Captain Kirk hooking up with the native wildlife.
Well, our captain isn't here.
The nookie factor.
Yes. So draw your own conclusions, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, so if you're interested in what I'm doing, you can go out to jeffhite.com and find out where my crazy mind is taking me, and learn about any new stories that I'm coming out with. But most of all, go out to flyingislandpress.com, check out what we're working on. We have a new issue coming out relatively soon, and we are always accepting new stories. So please check that out. And if you are interested or you've got a story, please go ahead and submit one of those to us. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And Scott, you want to take us out?
Sure, I definitely want to thank you for joining us for yet another Galley Table podcast. We appreciate you guys hanging in there through some of the audio difficulties, and thank you for your support. Check out the magazine, and we will see you next time at the Galley Table.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Adios.
Alright.
Or